Welcome to this week's Who the Folk podcast. I'm Lonnie Goldsmith, the editor of TC Jewfolk. This week I talked to Minnesota State Representative Sandra Feist. We talk about the historic Minnesota legislative session that wrapped up last week, her day job as an immigration attorney, and how her Judaism informs both of her jobs on this week's Who the Folk podcast. State Representative Sandra Feist, welcome to the Who the Folk podcast. Thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
So we are now in your regular day-to-day office. You're an immigration attorney in your day job, but your other day job, because neither of these are really part-time jobs, is as a state legislature. And in my 21 years in Minnesota, this is probably the most productive legislative session that I can remember. How are you feeling? We are less than 3 days since it wrapped up. How has it been since then, and how are you sort of coming back down to earth after all of it?
Yeah, well, I'm definitely still processing my emotions. It was a very productive session. I personally authored 28 bills that passed into law, which I've been told might be the most ever.
Wow.
We're looking into that. But yeah, I basically made the decision after the election that I was just going to work my butt off and get as much done as humanly possible. Because the really great thing about the trifecta isn't just that you can pass really impactful, bold legislation. Mm-hmm. The other thing about a trifecta is that really mundane good governance legislation doesn't get held up in negotiations.
Right.
And so I had a number of bills that were not controversial but were really important. And those bills I was able to just really move efficiently through the process. And that was incredibly satisfying.
So I would think that sometimes the most important stuff is not the sexiest. It's not the headline grabbing.
Yeah, I actually have this dream of boring bill day because there's all sorts of unsexy bills that are really, really important.
Right.
The one that is my gold standard of boring bills is a bill for the county recorders. So there were all of these technical updates to how we file titles to real property.
Okay.
And there's this housekeeping committee with the County Recorders Association, and they did all this work. And it's just this incredibly mundane, technical, incomprehensible bill. But it did a lot of important things.
Yeah.
And I just feel like all of those county recorders who worked so hard on their housekeeping committee to do this work, deserve that recognition. So
Right.
I thought that Governor Walz could get all of the boring bills together and all of those, bureaucrats and experts who worked on these technical updates and celebrate their achievements too.
Because sometimes the good governance stuff makes the lives of so many people, rather be it average citizens or the sort of day-to-day county and city, employees, makes their lives so much easier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Another really good example is a bill that actually took about 2 decades to pass. But it was an agreement between owners of manufactured housing communities and advocates for residents to regulate better the way that park owners pass on the cost of utilities to residents. And so it creates more uniformity and transparency. And it's actually incredibly meaningful in the lives of those manufactured housing residents, which is the largest form of affordable housing in the state. And so it's this bill that I'm sure is not going to get any attention, but it actually is a huge deal and was the result of literally decades of work by the legal aid lobbyists to get it across the finish line.
That's phenomenal. That's so important. It impacts so many people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I don't know, call me old-fashioned, but I feel like sometimes the role of government and the legislators and those in charge of those sorts of things is to make lives better for their constituency.
Yeah, ideally. That's what we're doing.
So what do you think? Obviously, so many things got passed. A lot of things, like you said, that didn't make a lot of headlines, and obviously some very consequential, big picture things did. I don't know if you can even narrow it down to one, but what do you think was the most important thing that passed in the session?
Oh, that's impossible.
I know, such a loaded question. I understand.
I can tell you my top favorites.
Sure. Give me your favorites then. We'll give you that one.
Yeah. So going into the session, we were asked to list out our 3 personal priorities and our 3 caucus priorities.
Okay.
So I could talk about my caucus priorities that I listed. For me, restoring the vote to felons who have served their time and are out in our community was incredibly important. And that's something that, again, people have been working towards for decades. That was personally a big priority for me. I just feel like it's a matter of like having a robust democracy, ensuring that people who have had a difficult life and gone off the beaten path, they're back in the communities. We want them to succeed and thrive. And we know that when people are allowed to vote, that they feel more invested in the betterment of society as a whole. So that was, for me, one of the really important achievements of the session. Another one was just the legislation around reproductive freedom. So we passed the PRO Act, the Reproductive Freedom Defense Act, as well as a number of repealers of just outdated laws that made it difficult for people to access, the full spectrum of reproductive health care. That was a priority for me. It was a priority for my community, and I know it was a priority for the majority of Minnesotans. So I was excited about that collection of legislation. And I think that the third thing I wrote, there were so many things that were great, but I also wrote the cannabis legalization.
Sure.
That was a really big step forward just in terms of righting a historical wrong, in terms of a war on drugs that really impacted communities of color. And the way that that legislation was crafted is just really forward-looking and really deep, like a lot of deep thought went into it. And I'd love to call out Representative Jess Hansen, who has been working on this issue for many years before she was in the legislature. And it was her contributions that really focused on the equity angle of that legislation. So repairing harm, expungements, giving opportunities to communities that have been historically harmed by that legislation. That was all incredibly important, deep work that went into passing that legislation.
I mean, it was like, if you just listed those three, like those alone are huge things that got done. But obviously there were so many on top of that. And it's interesting, I think a lot of people, because this is, I think what happens, has turned the democracy-related provisions that passed, including, released felons getting their right to vote back, have called it out as some sort of vote grab or something, have tried to put a nefarious spin on it. But, in talking with Secretary of State Simon, as we're recording this a couple of days ago, he has said, he's like, this is nonpartisan. And it's been something, a lot of these bills have been a lot of those provisions in the democracy-related reforms have been in the works for a number of years, including back to his days as a state representative in St. Louis Park. This is not Democrat or Republican. This is nonpartisan work that got done.
Yeah. And in particular, the felon reenfranchisement is not partisan. Studies have shown that people tend to vote based on geographically where they're from. And we know that the people who have been incarcerated, who are back in their communities, they're not specifically from blue areas of the state. And so there's no reason to believe that those folks whose vote has been restored are going to vote DFL or GOP.
Right. So on the flip side of all of that, what didn't get done that you hoped would?
I tried not to lead with this, but my heart is still hurting over the nurses' bill. That was the bill that I worked on all session, and it did not get across the finish line in the form that it should have.
Is there a way to pick it back up, when you start again next February, or, correct some of the things that didn't maybe get done with it? How do you fix that?
I'm thinking about it. So just to provide a little more specificity. So the nurses' bill did a lot of things, but it did two very important things. First, it gave nurses a voice in staffing. And that is something that is becoming increasingly problematic in terms of understaffing in hospitals. And then the second thing it did is it's protected nurses under labor law if they spoke up and said that under their professional license that they could not safely accept an additional patient assignment, that it was dangerous to the patient. And so those two provisions did not make it across the finish line. And I definitely am going to be looking at ways that we can pick that up next session. I do think that I do wish that it had passed past session when we were doing all of this historic work.
Yeah.
I mean, I worked on other really meaningful, dramatic legislation around labor protections. I chief authored a bill to protect construction workers from wage theft, as well as a bill that updated our labor trafficking laws to protect primarily construction workers who are undocumented. So there was so much that we did in the labor front, and so I was pretty heartbroken to see the nurses bill not the provisions that were most important not pass the finish line. But I am pretty tenacious, so we'll see what happens next session.
So you did mention several things that sort of tie into your immigration law work. There's the labor stuff that you worked on, but it does tie to the immigration. What led you to becoming an immigration lawyer?
So I graduated from undergrad, UW-Madison, with a plan to become a Broadway star. So I was going to move to New York, but then I decided I was not a great dancer. And so I moved on to New Orleans to sing.
Okay.
So I was singing jazz down in New Orleans, but you don't make money singing dive bars on weekends. And so I answered a random ad in the newspaper for a paralegal position at an immigration firm.
Okay.
And that was in late 2000. And that was right leading up to an immigration deadline. That was April 30th, 2001, where it was like an all hands on deck. Every immigration firm was just like trying to file as many of these cases as humanly possible. And so with like no qualifications whatsoever, I was hired because they just needed warm bodies. And I just found my calling working at an immigration firm, helping people get green cards and work visas and citizenship.
Wow.
And so after several years, I decided to go to law school.
Okay. And so, hang on, I had to go back to this jazz singing thing. So, were you like a theater major? What was your...
I was history and political science. So,
so nothing related to the stage whatsoever.
No, but I did theater my whole life, starting at like an early age, like 7, I think was the first show I did.
Okay.
And then I was in shows consistently up to the summer after I graduated from undergrad.
Okay.
And so I was doing a lot of roles and some paid. So I don't know. I didn't fit into like the theater program or the music program mold.
Okay.
Because UW-Madison was not like focused on music theater specifically, and so I had a vision.
Yeah, I mean it's hard like at a big state school to focus on that sort of thing.
Yeah.
I would think it could be a little challenging.
Yeah, I just kind of found my own path.
That's awesome.
So yeah.
So okay, I want to go back to the politics stuff, but you sort of teed it up for immigration law very easily there. So you're on the Public Safety, Finance, and Policy Committee that you're the vice chair of. You're also on the Economic Development, Finance, and Policy, the Judiciary, Finance, and Civil Law, and the Education Policy Committees. Those are like, there's a lot of big stuff happening in the work you do. What is it about these particular areas that you wanted to get involved in at that level?
Yeah, so I definitely gravitated towards the quote-unquote lawyer committees. So I really wanted to do public safety and judiciary because that's where the lawyer nerds fit right in. Specifically with public safety, I really wanted to be vice chair because I wanted to focus on juvenile justice. And that is an area that a lot of people understand is something we should be focusing on, but people haven't really made it like their thing. And so when I was kind of deciding, I really wanted to focus on kids. And so I was looking at my schedule, and education finance overlapped with public safety, and I kind of had to choose between those two loves. And I decided that I could bring something that wouldn't otherwise be brought to the public safety realm. And so that was why I really wanted to focus on public safety, was to focus on youth justice. And I did, which was great.
That's awesome.
And definitely in public safety and judiciary, there is that intersection with immigrant and refugee communities and policy. And so if I could, I can tell you a little bit about the immigration-related legislation that I worked on in those realms.
That would be great.
Cool. So one bill that I came in that was on my list of personal priorities, because I knew nobody else would care about this little bill but me, was a bill to change the definition of gross misdemeanor by 1 day. So currently the definition of gross misdemeanor has a maximum possible period of imprisonment of 365 days. And we changed that to 364 days, and we made it retroactive. And so the reason that we did that is currently under Minnesota state law, a gross misdemeanor under state law can be considered what's called an aggravated felony under immigration law. and an aggravated felony is like almost automatically deportable offense. And so like pretty low level offenses were getting people like automatically deported. And so that was one where I was just like, this is like the intersection of my immigration lawyer nerd self and my legislator self.
Yes.
And so that was like a huge priority. And we did actually pass it individually off the House floor with full bipartisan support, which is awesome.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I was able to really emphasize to my colleagues across the aisle that Minnesota should decide what are the collateral consequences of a Minnesota conviction, not the federal government.
Yeah.
And everybody agreed. So that was something that was like really, really exciting and something was a personal priority for me this session. Other bills that I worked on on specifically impacting New Americans was the Office of New Americans bill. So we currently have an Office of New Americans as a temporary governor-appointed position within DEED, the Department of Employment and Economic Development.
Yes.
And this made it permanent, funded, ongoing.
Oh,
and this is part of a national effort to get these Office of New Americans in every state. And so I'm really excited about that because it's going to be one office that can, in a more cohesive way, reach out to all New American communities and provide just ways that they can, fully integrate into the community and have the supports they need, and also, find ways for them to be integrated into the workforce. So I'm really, really excited about that as well.
That's really exciting.
Yeah.
That's it's fun. It's fun when your non-legislative work life can coincide with your legislative work life.
Yeah, and as an immigration expert, that does not happen as naturally as it does in some, like if you're a prosecutor, then like it's always going to intersect.
Yes.
But yeah, I find my ways to make a difference. And I'm also working with a bunch of advocates on a bill that would prohibit state dollars from being spent on immigration enforcement. Oh. And so that's a project for the interim. I'll be meeting with just community members and advocates and other legal experts just to make sure that we're crafting a bill that is thoughtful and deliberate and can actually pass.
So the session ended, but obviously the legislative work sort of stops, like in St. Paul, but like the work you're doing there's still going to be work to do as a state representative, right? What does that look like in these months in between sessions?
So everybody handles their schedule differently.
Okay.
It's interesting how there's not really a job description, and so
which feels really weird if you think about it.
It's really hard for like teachers' pets like me, where I'm like, am I doing it right? Am I doing it right? And so like having no metric to be like, did I do it right?
Yeah.
Because I mean, even like the number of bills doesn't really mean anything because you could have worked all session to pass like a monumental bill, and that is more impactful than a bunch of small bills. So like there is no like metric. But the way I approach my interim is that I work really hard on legislation that requires a lot of stakeholder input. So for the past 2 years, I worked on my restorative justice legislation. And the reason that I was able to get it passed and create a permanent Office of Restorative Practices within the Department of Public Safety and like $1 bajillion in grants, the reason I was able to do that was because I had a million conversations during the interim 2 years in a row. Mm-hmm. So reaching out to prosecutors and judges, restorative justice experts, youth justice experts, child welfare experts, community members, people who have been harmed by youth violence. Like we needed to have all those conversations, gather all that input so that we could write really good legislation that would have broad support. And so that's how I use my interim. And then I start drafting like in the fall. Mm-hmm. And so I did that last year too. So if you look at the bill numbers, like all the 40s were mine because I had like a bunch of bills jacketed like in the fall before session began.
Wow.
So yeah, so I use my time wisely.
You getting a jump on things.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because I've talked to plenty of people on the stakeholder side. It's Jewish Community Action, Jewish Community Relations Council, National Council of Jewish Women Minnesota, who are working almost always in coalition, almost never on their own, working with legislators to get the best bills possible put together. Mm-hmm. And that work happens well before the session starts.
Mm-hmm. If I can interrupt to
Please.
say, National Council of Jewish Women is amazing, and they were like my main collaborators on the menstrual equity legislation. So I just want to give a shout out to them.
And I talked with Beth Gendler, who of course is now at JCA, but the Menstrual Equity Act, she had mentioned, she was very quick to mention to me when we spoke that even though she's not as involved anymore because she's not at NCJW, that bill passing meant obviously so much to her, that going as part of the education bill, and mentioned you as a big reason for why it got included and got funding and is passed, and also at the statewide at the Minsky level as well. That is just such a huge thing that I know has meant so much to her and NCJW for so long.
Yeah, she was a force of nature. It was awesome working with her and with Erica Solomon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They are both incredible, and it is such a, I mean, it's just so huge that finally got done, because I know I have been talking with Beth about it for a long time. And I wrote a huge roundup of sort of the Jewish priorities of the session, and I think somehow that there was a couple things that didn't get in, and I think unfortunately that might have been one of them. So folks, that's a big deal to NCJW and the Jewish community that got done, and to people statewide who need menstrual products. It's incredibly important.
Yeah. And I think one other thing about that bill that was very affirming was that it was brought to me by students, and the people who led every step of the way were students. NCJW provided a lot of the infrastructure and support and logistics, and was a big part of kind of how we crafted the legislation. But when it came to like being out there and championing it, the students were just a real inspiration across the aisle. It was really remarkable. And so I give a lot of credit to like young people who cared so much about this.
That's really, I mean, it's great. And it's got to feel good to you as a legislator to see the next generation leading and being so active in the issues that are most important to them.
Yeah, definitely. And it gives me a little bit of hope. A lot of hope.
A lot of hope is good. Little hope is good too, but I'm glad it gives you a lot of hope. So I'm going to take a step back from the session. You're in the middle of your second term in office. What was it that inspired you to run in the first place back in 2020?
So I had just come off of 4 years as an immigration attorney under Trump and was feeling pretty down.
Yeah.
It was obviously incredibly painful interlude, and I was feeling like the world was a pretty dark place.
Yeah.
And so there was retirement in my district. Senator Carolyn Lane announced her retirement, and then Representative Mary Kunesh decided to run for her seat. So there was an open seat.
Okay.
And someone texted my husband and said he should run, and he was like, no, not my thing. But he was like, Sandra should run. And so we had to make a decision within a couple of days because it was an open seat in a blue area and lots of interest.
Yeah.
And so we just talked it through and just decided that, we both have careers that we love, that are meaningful, we make enough money, but we just felt like we had more to give to the community. And so we decided that it was something that I and really we should do as a household.
It's a very much a family decision, I'd imagine, right? Like you put in a lot of, between your two jobs, these are long, hard days a lot of times.
Always. Always. My husband and I were talking about how basically since the endorsement race last spring, I've just been in full intense work mode. So for over a year, it's just been like nonstop intensity. But it is worth it.
Yeah.
It really is. I definitely need a little break, and I'm trying not to ramp up too much at my law firm. I'm trying to give myself a little bit of a breather. But it is worth it. And going back to the reason that I ran, I just felt like trying to do something about like the macro level injustices of immigration law felt like very futile at that moment. And so I wanted to do something really concrete that I could see the benefit of, so help the people around me, in particular like the immigrant and refugee communities in Minnesota. I felt like that would help me to be a force for good in a world where I couldn't control everything.
It was certainly felt like an out of control world.
Yeah.
I'm sure for you in your role. I mean, I think for a lot of people in their roles, but I think so much was made of the immigrant community and the immigration system in that time period. That I can see how it might feel hopeless.
Yeah, it was just like a physical assault, like every day for 4 years, like a physical, like every day I woke up and I felt like I'd been punched in the chest. Like it was just like every day they just threw new things at us, like that you couldn't predict and you couldn't prevent, and all you could do is just keep fighting. So you'll see, you're in my office.
I am.
I have the entire speech by Sam from Lord of the Rings in the Two Towers. Towards the end, they're in Osgiliath. I don't know if you remember the speech, but anyway.
I am not a...
You're not a Lord of the
not
Rings
a Lord
dork?
of the Rings person, sorry.
Well, anyway, there's a speech that one of the characters gives about how he kind of understands why people keep fighting. And anyway, for the Lord of the Rings fan, Sam's speech at Osgiliath, the entire speech is on my wall, because they're like, it ends with him saying because the heroes in the great books knew what they were fighting for, and then Frodo's like, what were they fighting for, Sam? And he's like, there is some good in this world, and it's worth fighting for. So I just think of that, and I thought of that for all 4 years, and I still kind of hold that in my heart.
It feels like, and I say this with zero background on this topic whatsoever, but to be as active as a bill writer and policymaker and vice chair of a committee in your second term, it feels like, I'm not trying to advance you too quickly in this job, but it feels like you're really going after this job. Like you are throwing your whole self into representing your district.
Yes. That's just how I kind of treat everything in my life.
Okay.
Sorry, that's not a very exciting answer.
No,
but yes, I mean, this is an honor. Yeah. And it's an opportunity, and I think people who don't work this hard are not making the most of it. I think there's so many things that are such a joy and honor about this job that aren't public. If I have questions, I can reach out to staff and be like, how can I fix this? I have an issue. What can I do? It's just there's such opportunity to just think for yourself and look at problems that other people haven't tackled yet. And it's like the job is as expansive and ambitious as you want to make it. Mm-hmm. And I choose to make it very, very ambitious.
Well, that's awesome. I know the district is certainly better for it, as well as the state of Minnesota and the Jewish community for the work you've done. How do you see your Judaism informing both what you do as an immigration attorney and as a legislator?
Yeah.
Sorry, as a legislator.
It's an interesting question. I started attending these monthly gatherings of Jewish public officials, past and present, mm-hmm. and I think that has helped me to think about this question kind of more systematically than I necessarily would have. So I was raised in a conservative Jewish household in Green Bay. Okay. My mom and her family are from Minnesota, so they belong to Bethel. And so I was raised, going to synagogue and going to Camp Herzl and then Camp Ramah. And so it was a big part of my life and my upbringing. But I think, meeting with these public officials of varying levels has been really interesting because we kind of look at different Jewish texts and think about what they mean for us as public officials. And so some of the themes that we've talked about are humility, which is something that matters a lot to me. I think we need to hold really tight to our humility as public officials because you get sucked up to by everyone at all times, and it is not healthy. And I know that for me, I have to really hold tight to my humility because our egos will get away with us. Yeah. There's also, I think, being deliberative is something that comes up a lot in the various texts that we've talked about. Gathering input, trying to understand something before you speak. I don't think that's like a universal politician trait, but I do think it's something that has like its roots in Judaism and Jewish kind of culture and like religious philosophy.
Yeah.
So I think about that as well. And I think just in general, I was just raised like in a very philosophical kind of household. like we approach things like really thinking deeply about issues and about societal woes and about solutions. And so, and I think, again, it goes back to like thinking before you act, thinking before you speak, thinking before you form an opinion. And I feel like that all kind of comes back to that Jewish heritage as well.
Well, it is excellent to see how you've embraced it, how you really are stopping to think about the impact of everything that you do, the deliberativeness with which clearly you've worked so far as a legislator. But last couple of questions we want to hit you with. Same two we always end with. So
Ooh, I should have prepared.
That's okay. Sometimes it's better when you don't. First, what is your favorite Jewish holiday?
I guess Purim.
Okay.
Yeah, because I'm a big Halloween person. I had to think about that because like holidays are all great.
Yes.
But I was like, not the ones where you can't eat. So yeah, I mean, I'm a big Halloween person, and Purim is the Jewish Halloween.
It is.
And my favorite Purim memory for the listeners is when my sister and I dressed up as Simon and Garfunkel. And we made new lyrics to The Sound of Silence. And I don't remember any of the lyrics except for that it was like, hello, Rabbi, my old friend.
Ever the theater kid.
Yeah, exactly. And I like froed up my hair.
Oh, fantastic.
It was kind of amazing. So yeah.
That's fantastic. And what is your favorite Jewish food?
I guess gefilte fish.
Whoa.
Yeah, which is weird. And so my kids...
It's a borderline hot take. You don't get that. I think maybe
you don't get
like
that answer that often?
handful of
It's like
times
mostly
tops.
latkes.
Yeah, a lot of latkes, a lot of
I
challah.
like macaroons.
Macaroons.
Yeah.
Wow, don't get that one either.
I like.
Wow.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh, interesting. I was eating gefilte fish this Passover and thinking how weird it is that I like it. It really is probably objectively gross, but I do like it.
I kind of with you, but I wouldn't call it a favorite, but I don't dislike it either. Like it's there, I'm going to eat it, but
it's not a fave.
Not many people are going to say it's a favorite though. It's wild.
I don't know. It popped into my head right away.
That's amazing. That's
I went
probably
with
the
my
right
gut.
answer then.
Yeah.
State Representative Sandra Feist, thank you so much for sitting down with me. Thank you for your work on behalf of your district and the state and the community. We deeply appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
The Who the Folk podcast is part of the Jew Folk Podcast Network, a product of Jew Folk Inc. Please subscribe, rate, and review the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you have suggestions for other podcast guests, please email them to me at editor@tcjewfolk.com. For our other shows, check out tcjewfolk.com/podcast.